The 0% buyer's agent MLS commission is now officially here. This will be an increasing trend going forward as these changes are implemented this summer. I think we're going to see a lot more of these 0% buyer's agent commissions. And as we figure out what we're going to do as a standardized procedure, industry standard on how to address this, I'm going to show you in this video a few different ways that you can make sure the buyer's agent commission is secure despite whatever's thrown at you. So let me show you what I'm talking about. I'll start here with the MLS. So I'm looking at the MLS and I pulled it up today, Monday, March 18th. And I went to toggle the results. Now, these are active listings in Orange County. Now, it won't let you toggle the buyer's agent commission for whatever reason. You can toggle other stuff like this, but not the buyer's agent commission. But don't worry, I'm still able to do it because I'm just going to toggle by listings that are entered today on the MLS. These are the absolute newest listings uploaded to the MLS. And look what we have down here in the buyer's agent commission column, 0%. Let's go ahead and click on this. Now, I'm not going to show the private agent remarks and cause any problems, but I am going to scroll down to the note about the commission. And we'll see right down here, buyer to pay buyer's broker fee, which can be added to the sales price. This agent's telling you, hey, the buyer has to pay their own commission, but hint, hint, it can be added to the sales price, just like a seller credit. Now let's look at the purchase agreement. This is an RPA I have up. Page 1, page 2. Now, for all of you that are very familiar with seller credits, and we have one right here, you would add, so I have an example, $5,000. This is a classic scenario, $5,000 seller credit to buyer. And when the listing agent takes this offer to their seller, they say, hey, we have a purchase price offer of $1 million, but they want a seller credit. So it's a net offer of $995. Just factor that in, Mr. and Mrs. Seller. Well, I think the same thing is going to happen with commissions, because if you have a listing, just like the one we looked at, where there's a 0% buyer's agent commission, and this agent hints that it can be added to the sales price, you're going to do a very similar thing as the credit scenario. So you're going to write, and I put here in additional finance terms, seller to pay buyer's brokerage a commission of 2.5% of the sales price, just like the seller credit. So a listing agent is going to take the offer and say, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, we have an offer for $1 million even. Now keep in mind that the buyer's agent is asking for you to pay their commission of 2.5%, which is $25,000. So the net offer is $975. So just like a seller credit, you're going to see buyer's agent's commissions added, and then it's going to have to be factored into the price. Now, of course, the buyer's agent is going to try to bump that price up as much as possible so that the seller doesn't feel like they're taking that much of a hit. And this happens with seller credits now, right? If you ask for a $5,000 credit, you're going to push that purchase price up to take the burden off the seller, and then it gets dealt with the appraisal, and everyone hopes the appraisal comes in. It's not perfect, but it's the best system, and that's how it works for seller credits, and I think that's how it's going to work for these buyer's agent commissions. Because again, all this Sitzer Burnett and all these complaints boil down to one thing. The outcome is that the seller can opt out of paying the buyer's agent commission. The seller is not obligated to pay the buyer's agent commission from the outset. And the seller can opt in as well. And who knows, maybe the majority of sellers will opt in to offer buyer's agent commission, but we don't know. We just know that we are going to see an increasing trend in 0% commissions. And since we're so early in this massive industry change, we're going to have to basically, through trial and error, come to a default industry standard. All right, let me show you some other ways to address this. So CAR added this provision here right below this additional finance terms. And they said, seller agrees to pay the obligation of buyer to compensate buyer's broker under a separate agreement. Okay, so for those of you familiar with the buyer representation agreement, it basically stipulates that the buyer owes their agent a commission. Of course, the amount the buyer owes is reduced by whatever the listing broker pays their agent. And so that's how it lets the buyer off the hook to pay the commission, because a buyer's agent gets the buyer representation agreement signed. And then the buyer's agent writes an offer and says, hey, remember how on the buyer representation agreement you Mr. Buyer, owe me 2.5%. Well, here's the good news. The listing agent is offering 2.5% in the MLS, so it cancels it out. You don't owe me anything. And that is the overwhelming standard. Okay, let's go down to this form because it incorporates this new form, this SPBB. And quite frankly, I think this form's extremely problematic. So let me jump over here on this tab. Okay, so this is the form. Now, when you see this form, so they're already stating the obvious on the RPA. On the RPA, it's already saying that so it says right here that it's the seller agrees to pay the obligation of a buyer to compensate buyer's broker under a separate agreement. Okay. So now it says there's like this preamble. Use this form only if buyer and buyer's agent already entered into a buyer representation agreement. Well, if they're already in that agreement, in many cases, it won't even matter. You won't even need to do this form because there'll be a co-listing brokerage, a compensation in the MLS. So already this is kind of like, okay, well, it would be more helpful if this form wasn't subject to it because it would streamline what I put up here before. This will need to be streamlined eventually. What I'm doing here, some form of this or some change is going to happen that incorporates this. And this is not the substitute that we need right here. This is not a proper substitute because it says you've already entered into the buyer representation agreement. Now, keep in mind, the MLS has said part of that NAR settlement is that MLS members, which is basically every realtor, is required to have a buyer representation agreement. So maybe they're banking on the fact that everyone will have it. We'll see, but gosh, I mean, so already this form is like, doesn't help you unless you already have this. And then it has two other requirements. Buyer has an obligation to pay a buyer's broker compensation. Hopefully this was filled out properly because sometimes agents forget to do that because they're afraid, they're intimidated to ask their buyer to pay. Gosh, that's going to change real quick. And then buyer is asking seller to pay buyer's broker all or portion. Okay, so the seller already pays it through the listing agent. All right, but now we're pretending the listing agent's offering zero, and we're asking for the buyer representation amount to be credited directly from the seller. Okay, so this is what we have here so far as a preamble. Now, if all that's true, if you've met these three conditions, you can move on. And what does it say? How much is on? So I'll break this down. I'll simplify this form because this thing's actually very confusing how it's worded. I'll make it real simple. It says, buyer representation agreement, how much is on it for the buyer to pay the buyer's agent? I put 3% as an example. Okay, we move on. How much is the listing broker offering to pay? That would be in the MLS, right? The listing broker takes a listing, gets a percentage, offers an amount to the buyer. I put less just for the sake of an example. I'm pretending that the MLS is offering 2.5%. Now, it could be zero here, just like that listing we saw in the beginning. It could be zero. Now, number 3 is where we reconcile all this. Now, basically, it's saying the seller pays the difference. It can't be greater than this amount here. And they're saying in all this text, you basically subtract number 2 from number 1, and there's the difference that the seller pays. Now, this form is probably intended for number 2 to be 0, anticipating that there'll be a bunch of listings with a 0% cooperating broker compensation. And so they're asking the seller to pay the entire thing. This form could work if everyone has been diligent and has their buyer representation agreement. Right now, what percentage of agents do you think right here in March have a buyer representation agreement? Very, very few. Now that could change in July if the MLS says you must have it. Just like a listing agreement, you must have a listing agreement to be in the MLS. But this form could help then. It doesn't really solve. There's too much here, too many stipulations. This thing is just, it's too much. It's restrictive. It's, the big issue with car forms is there's so many overlaps and crossovers and reactive provisions, and they just keep adding and adding and layering, and it's like playing Twister, and next thing you know, you're just contorting yourself through form and twisting your arm and twisting. So they really need to just get in the habit of ripping things down and rebuilding them with simplicity as a major element in their thinking. Will that happen? Probably not. Okay, then there's a cooperating broker compensation agreement, okay? Now here's another simple, more direct way to do it. You write an offer, okay? You write an offer just like this, but we don't mess with any of this up here. Instead, we go down to, okay, this is page 4 of 16 of the purchase agreement. This is where there are all these boxes, and you can check a box to incorporate a document. We're going to go down here and check a box other, and we're going to incorporate the cooperating broker compensation CBC form. It's now part of the purchase agreement. Then we go over here and we fill it out. Okay, just all the basics up here. Now there are two ways we can fill this form out. One is we put modification of compensation on the MLS. So let's pretend this is on the MLS. I just wrote applicable here. You can actually probably write this on this form. It should be the name of the MLS. So I would put CRMLS because that's the one I use primarily. But you just put applicable if you want. So I check the box modification. Let's pretend we go back to this one, this listing we saw earlier that's offering 0%, okay? And what we do is we put 2.5%. That's what we want, right? We're modifying it. That's it. That's all you have to do. That's all you have to do. Now, the difference in doing this from what we've been doing before is before we've been addressing the seller directly. But now we're saying, hey, no, listing broker, you pay us. And they'll say, but my listing agreement doesn't have enough to cover the buyer's agent. And we say, that's your problem. Go back and do a MT form and charge your seller more. You go have the uncomfortable conversation with your seller. But this is what I want from you. This is where we make the demand directly to the listing agent, not the seller directly. And that's basically a way to put the burden on the listing agent to hash it out with the listing agent. Now, with the seller. Now, the listing agent might come back and say, okay, I can change, I can get you your commission, but we need a higher offer. I mean, all this stuff isn't very pretty, to be honest. Negotiating commission with the purchase, with the offer, it's really tacky, quite frankly. But this is the world we live in, thanks to the outcome of this lawsuit. All right. Okay. And then, and by the way, that settlement, so that lawsuit already creates all sorts of changes, but that settlement really, that puts these changes in stone. Okay. Now down here, here's another way. If you don't want a modification of the MLS, fine. Just check the box other. Listing broker shall pay the buyer's broker 2.5% of the sales price. Same thing we did in the very beginning where we said that the seller, where is it? Page 2, where we said the seller pays the buyer brokerage. All right. If you don't want to just negotiate with the seller directly, fine. Ask the listing broker. Say, you know what? I want you to pay 2.5%. I've incorporated this CBC form in the offer. You pay me the 2.5%. And they'll say, but I don't know if I can do that. And okay, go have that conversation with your client. You tell the seller, I have a buyer that's willing to pay, but you have this problem and you two figure it out. Your problem, not mine. It's cold, but I'm just telling you. I'm telling you every way this can be done. This is it. I'm telling you all the tools you have. You don't like one of these methods, don't use it, but I'm just arming you with all the info. And that's it. You can say this is part of the agreement, and it puts the burden on the listing broker, and you pressure them to pressure the seller to figure it out. That's it. All right, so quick recap. This form incorporated into the purchase agreement by adding that cooperating broker compensation, that's putting pressure on the listing agent to then pressure the seller. You want to go to the seller direct? Go up and use this method. Just write it in and say, hey, seller, you got to pay me 2.5% of the sales price. That's part of the deal. And then if you have a buyer's broker agreement and you want to play this game, you can do it. You can check this box here and fill this thing out. I honestly don't like this, to be honest, but it's patchwork. This whole thing is just it's because there's that buyer broker agreement, by the way, which is too long, too intimidating. It creates provisions, and they need to counter, or I don't want to say counter, but they need to alleviate the obligation of the buyer by having this form. If you have a buyer representation agreement, you're welcome to use this. You can read it. And if you have questions, leave a comment. But that's it. I wanted to make a quick video. I want to jump on now that we're in the 0% buyer's agent commission world. Hopefully this helps. Thank you for watching.